Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this last Civita breakfast before the summer. We are also streaming this live on the internet, and welcome to you too as well, who are following this on the net. My name is Morten Kinander. I'm a fellow here at Civita, and I will be hosting this breakfast meeting this morning. This morning's speaker needs no extensive introduction. It's Harvard professor Niall Ferguson, who is undoubtedly one of the leading public intellectuals of our time and one of the most prominent economic historians for the last 20 or 30 years or so. So in that connection, let me extend my gratitude to Sector Asset Management and Asle Toje for making this event happen. The title of this meeting is The World Economy in a Time of Divergence, Money, Energy, Democracy, and Complexity. No modest title. In just a few seconds, I'll give the floor to Professor Ferguson, but before that, a few practical details. And for those of you who've been here a lot, these might seem like the in-flight security announcement, but please do pay attention nevertheless. These are even more important. Please remember to introduce yourself when asking questions and speak up as we do not have a microphone. And if you are going to ask some questions, please let them be that and not comments or half or semi-lectures. And let me assure you, I will intervene if I smell a lecture. And you will be embarrassed. I'm aware that there are people sitting in the back, and I'll try to take you into account as well, so you will be able to ask questions. So introduce yourself, short questions, please. This meeting will finish no later than 9:10 due to flight schedules, and I will kindly ask you to remain in your seat until then. This is important. And we also urge you to use the social media distractions, and the Twitter hashtag for this meeting is Civita Frokost. And lastly, turn off your mobile phones or silence them. That would be the practical matter. Now for the talk. Professor Ferguson will speak for about 15-20 minutes or so, and then we'll open up for questions. So with that, I'll give the word to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Morgan. Good morning. It's unusual for me to have breakfast with so many people. I intend to keep this breakfast informal, so I'm not going to stand up and harangue you with a tedious monologue. Rather, I'm going to offer a few ideas about the way I think about the world today, and then invite you to join me in a breakfast chat. The theme that I want to explore with you this morning is the theme of divergence. It's conventional in at least some schools of economic thought to emphasize convergence, to argue, as I've argued in my recent book, Civilization, that the great theme of our time is a convergence of East and West, of North and South. Convergence in terms of economic institutions, economic performance, living standards, and lifestyles. But in the midst of the long-run convergence that one can associate with globalization and information technology, we see in the world of 2015 some striking divergences. And I'm not the only commentator to use this word. I think it's partly inspired by a movie called Divergent, that if you have teenage children, you may have heard of. This movie was made because they could not make sequels to the Hunger Games fast enough. So they decided to replicate the concept of teenagers engaging in violence, always a popular genre in the United States. Well, the divergences that interest me are not divergences between teenage types, as in the movie Divergent, but divergences between nations or economies, if you prefer. Now, you're probably now expecting me to talk about emerging markets and developed markets, or market systems and state systems. You might expect me to sound a bit like my colleague at Harvard, Joe Nye, and talk about hard power and soft power. But those are not the kinds of divergence that I want to talk about. I think there are 4 divergences in the world today that we should try to understand. One is a divergence in the realm of monetary policy between, let's call them the taperers, those who are unwinding the unconventional monetary policies of the last 7 years, with the Federal Reserve System in the lead, and those central banks that are still engaged in one form or other of stimulus, whether you call it quantitative easing or large-scale asset purchases. There are central banks, notably the Bank of Japan and the European Central Bank, that are still very much engaged in unconventional monetary policy, the kinds of policy that prior to 2008, almost nobody wrote or thought about. So that's one pretty important divergence. If you're interested in financial markets, you'll know that every utterance of the Fed chair, Janet Yellen, moves capital across borders in vast quantities as markets try to anticipate what exactly the Fed will do. Will it raise rates this year? The answer is almost certainly yes, but not, I suspect, until September. What is the Fed's economic model? Nobody really knows. It has one, but it no longer has a theory to go with it. Everything is data dependent. If everything is data dependent and there is simply a vast quantity of data, then monetary policy is in fact discretionary. And so the great divergence in the realm of monetary policy is between those who feel it's time to taper and tighten and those who think they have to keep their foot firmly on the gas pedal. The second set of divergences that I see in the world today bears very directly on the situation of this country. I also come from a country with a population of less than 6 million and significant, though not quite as much, quantity of natural energy sources under the ground and sea, namely Scotland. Whenever I come to Norway, I think it's a kind of improved version of Scotland. Things work better, people fight less in the streets. When you look at the divergence between energy exporters and energy importers, it's a very striking feature of the last 12 months that unexpectedly, most people were completely surprised by this, the price of oil slumped. And it's not immediately obvious why it would bounce back towards $100 a barrel and not stay around $60 a barrel for some time. I think three things can explain this with the benefit of hindsight. I wish I'd been able to anticipate this with foresight. One, the slowdown in the Chinese economy. Two, the continued increase in supply from North America, not only the United States, but Canada and Mexico. And three, the behavior of the Saudi regime in seeking to fight for market share by increasing production at the expense of other more costly producers. I don't think these three things are about to go away. So you're an odd company. Most major energy exporters are not terribly nice. And some of them are distinctly unpleasant. So on the whole, it's a very good thing that oil should get cheaper. It's a very, very good thing for the European Union, which is a massive energy importer. It's going to be an increasingly important thing for China, which is swiftly becoming a massive energy importer. And indeed, it seems to me China's increasing reliance on imported energy will be one of the big themes of the next 10 to 20 years because of its strategic implications. So I think a big divergence to look at has to do with the impact of cheaper oil on the energy exporters. It's a kind of windfall benefit. It's like a tax cut for importers. But the interesting thing is that for exporters, cheaper oil has some very serious fiscal implications. It's a big disruptor if you are Iran. It's a big disruptor if you are Venezuela. It leaves a hole in your budget if you are Russia, and Russia was already under pressure in any case from sanctions. So I think this is a pretty important divergence, and it will of course have ongoing economic consequences for Norway, but it won't have political consequences for Norway, I suspect. It will have, and is already having, political consequences for those producers in the market whose oil is relatively expensive. Now I come to my third divergence, and I think this is the most interesting. This is a political divergence. The big divergence in the realm of politics is not between democracies and authoritarian regimes, although it might seem that way if you read the newspapers. The real divergence is between weak and strong governments. And most governments are weak, regardless of whether they are democratic or not. Let me talk about the democracies first. Why are all elections so close? Have you ever asked yourself that question? It's only a few weeks since I was sitting listening to the results of the UK election. And it was a remarkable and, to me, highly enjoyable experience. It's always good to see opinion pollsters embarrassed. It's even better to see Labour candidates lose their seats. And for me, at least, to watch Ed Balls lose his seat was a particularly delightful sensation. The real significance of the unexpected Conservative victory in the British elections, however, lies in the fact that it was so close. And although the Conservatives won an unexpected majority, the majority is very small. And it leaves David Cameron in something like the predicament John Major was in after 1992, when he only had a quite small majority. This was an election most people expected to produce a hung parliament, and many people expected ultimately to produce a Labour-led government. It was close, so close that the polls were nearly all wrong, and we did not know the result until the exit poll. And even the exit poll understated the result. The Israeli election was the same. Most people did not expect Netanyahu to do as well as he did in the Israeli election this year. And I could go on. I think there's an election in Denmark today. The result there will be close. There'll be an election for the President of the United States in 2016. I'm willing to bet you now that whoever the candidates are, the result will be close, as the result was at the last presidential election. Close enough that supporters of Mitt Romney expected, until results began to come through, that he would become president. Their polls seemed to suggest that. This has not always been the case. I remember great landslides of modern political history. Nixon, 72. Thatcher, 87. People used to win big. That no longer happens. Why? Why are all elections in almost all developed countries, and some less developed ones, think of the recent Nigerian election, which was too close to call. Why are all elections so close? I don't know if there are any political scientists in the room. I have yet to meet a political scientist with a good answer to this question. I've heard some bad ones. My hypothesis is that, perhaps subconsciously, this is what we want. Weak leaders. Leaders with wafer-thin majorities. Leaders with coalitions that have to be cobbled together over days, weeks, or if you're in Belgium, months and even years. We don't want strength in our leaders. And we vote to get the weak leaders that we secretly want. This is odd, but it seems to me to be a symptom of our time. Europe in particular is voting for weakness, voting for economic weakness, voting for military weakness, voting to disarm. To all intents and purposes, the major European countries have disarmed to levels that were imposed on Germany after World War I under the Treaty of Versailles. We do this now voluntarily. Tiny budgets, armed forces incapable really of action independently of the United States of America. And this brings me to my final divergence. In a world of weak governments, and I should add in parentheses, that on close inspection, the authoritarians are quite weak too. Don't be fooled into thinking that President Putin is strong. No, he's weak. The defining characteristic of President Putin's regime is its weakness. What happened in Ukraine was a consequence of a major failure of Russian policy. The overthrow of a Russian client in Kiev. And now it's very clear that the Russian military can achieve only so much in eastern Ukraine. There may be more fighting. I expect there will be more fighting there. But he's constrained, economically constrained, and he's also constrained by the number of casualties he can risk sustaining, which is small. There's no great appetite for war in Russia, not when it turns out to mean dead boys. Xi Jinping is not strong. If anything, the challenges to Xi Jinping's leadership are far greater than we in the West understand. There have, in fact, been a number of coup attempts against Xi, almost from the moment that it was clear he would be the next Chinese president. These attempts have not been reported in the Western media for a simple reason. If you were a correspondent of, say, the New York Times, and you wrote about these events, you would immediately be expelled or at least have your access to official sources withdrawn. So we think of Xi Jinping as this terrifically strong figure, the president of a fifth of humanity. We don't realize that he is embattled and that his anti-corruption drive is, in fact, a purge designed to remove from power those people who threaten his position. There are very few strong leaders in the world today, regardless of whether we're talking about democracies or authoritarian states. In the realm of geopolitics, the divergence that really interests me is between weak states and strong networks. The defining characteristic of our age is the strength of networks relative to established hierarchical structures. This is an age of networks. The mid-20th century was the high point of hierarchical states. There'll probably never be a hierarchical state more powerful than Stalin's Soviet Union. A state so powerful that one man had the power to intrude into the thoughts of his fellow citizens and the power to determine their life or death arbitrarily, on suspicion, without any due process. The technology of the mid-20th century empowered the hierarchy. Information flowed upwards, orders flowed downwards. The technology of our time weakens the hierarchies and empowers networks by allowing information to flow in all directions, but mainly horizontally. The shining example of a powerful network is the company Google. But there are less shining examples. There are dark examples. Islamic State is an extraordinarily powerful network. It's growing rapidly. It's spreading geographically. I wouldn't be surprised if there were supporters of Islamic State in Norway. It is horizontal and self-organizing. The United States remains fixated on the idea that it can somehow decapitate Islamic extremist organizations. But this is to misunderstand their structure. They're not hierarchical. Drone strikes follow drone strikes. Every other week we read that a leader of this or that organization has been assassinated. And every time I read about one of these assassinations, I also read on the same page that another city has fallen to Islamic State, and another 100 Europeans have left Europe to go to Syria to join Islamic State. You cannot decapitate a network. When I ask myself where we are heading, the answer that I come up with is that we are heading toward a 21st century in which the traditional hierarchical structures we have grown accustomed to, states, but also other hierarchical organizations, churches, will weaken inexorably, and networks will displace them. Let me conclude by inviting you to reflect on your own status. Are you a hierarchy person? Do you work for a classic, vertically structured corporation? Do you work for a classic, bureaucratically structured government agency? Or are you a networks person? Maybe Civita is a network. I'll find out, I suspect, in a moment. This is a network type event. Although I'm sitting on a slightly higher chair than everybody else. In a moment, I'll shut up. And even while I've been talking, some of you may have been writing abusive and contemptuous tweets about what I'm saying. That didn't used to happen. Public intellectuals used to be able to hold forth, and the worst thing they had to fear was a letter written in green ink by an angry person in some remote town. Now that angry person may have a website, a blog, may be able to send out 100 tweets to 1,000 followers. The network is all around. I think, however hierarchical your employer may be, universities typically are still quite hierarchical in their structure. In the United States, there are presidents and deans and divisions, and if you draw a network chart, it looks a little bit like the German army. But in practice, universities are highly networked, and increasingly it's the students who, if they are well organized, can bring and hold professors to account. I'm not going to tell you this is good or bad. It's not necessarily what historians have to do. It just is. The thing that differentiates our time from the time of our grandparents is this transition from the vertical and hierarchical to the horizontal and networked. Some of it's good, and some of it's very bad. In our time of divergence, it seems to me the rest of my life, I'm Scottish, I'm 51, so it wouldn't be that long. The rest of my life will be defined by these four divergences that I've just described to you. And with that, I think I will say no more and invite the network to respond. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ferguson, for stimulating no-nonsense, beating around the bush kind of introduction to the meeting here this morning. I'm going to open up for questions, so I think that you can spend a minute or so thinking about what you are going to ask if you have any questions. But let me ask you first, isn't it, well, there are trends here that you describe and anticipate the growth of. But for example, in the case of democracies, for example, they all seem very similar nowadays, don't they? And they still occupy, a large chunk of the planet, and they are structured more and more the same. So yes, you have a divergence between forms of between democracies on the one hand and other forms on the other hand, but nevertheless, the democratic spread, like Fukuyama kind of thinking that we're approaching the end of history and all that. But nevertheless, he seems to have a point that we are aspiring to more and more the same ideas within, the vast majority of the world.
I've just realized as you were talking that there were all these people behind me. I'd forgotten. I was completely forgetting that there were people sitting behind me. Apologies that you've seen so much of the back of my head as I was talking there. At some level, it's true that democracy has been a hugely successful political form. That, if one starts the clock in 1776, has been spreading globally in a series of waves. And we saw one of those waves at around about 1989 into the early 1990s. And the explanation for this is Churchill's, that democracy is the worst form of government apart from all the others that have been tried from time to time. Ultimately, the accountability that it creates is preferable to enlightened absolutism because, on the whole, there aren't that many Lee Kuan Yews. and there are surprisingly numerous Kim Jong-uns. And so it's preferable to create accountability, to allow for the fact that most authoritarian leaders are in fact incompetent and corrupt. This much is obvious. What is puzzling, though, is first the point I've made that whichever electoral system you choose, voters seem to divide quite evenly. There's a 50-50 phenomenon in most two-party systems, and the United States exemplifies this. We see, although there are relatively numerous voters who are up for grabs, floating voters, we see outcomes that are nearly always 50-50 these days. Why is that? Or in multi-party systems, we see outcomes that produce extremely complex and fragile coalitions from Israel to most continental European countries. And the second thing that is puzzling is that we seem able in many countries to have democracy but not the rule of law. This is a point that has been made, indeed, for many years by writers like Fareed Zakaria. If we fixate on democracy, meaning the act of choosing our leaders by voting, but ignore the importance of the rule of law, an independent judiciary, due process, and so forth, then we misunderstand the essentials of a free society. It is more important for freedom that there be an independent judiciary than that there be universal suffrage-based elections. If you had to choose, in my view, you would be advised and well advised to choose the rule of law over democracy. Because democracy without the rule of law has repeatedly produced disastrous results. So this seems to me to be one of the keys to understanding our time. Democracy is doing better than the rule of law. Most of the attempts globally to measure freedom are discouraging. Freedom is in retreat. Let me just give one example. In the Muslim world, as fundamentalist doctrines gain ground and Sharia law is imposed, think of Brunei, the rights of half of humanity are reduced. Women's rights are systematically reduced. Women end up as second-class citizens. We sit in a country like this and pride ourselves on how many women are in parliament or government or at high levels of corporate governance. We overlook the fact that worldwide feminism is losing. The achievements of the campaign for equal rights between the sexes are being undone worldwide right now, and often with apparently democratic support, with votes for turning the clock back. So that's, it seems to me, the key thing. One could have democracy spread still further. We could even ultimately, perhaps in my children's lifetime, see something like democracy in China. One often hears when one's in Beijing the argument that democracy will come to China, just not yet. But perhaps it will come at some point. Will the rule of law come? I believe the rule of law will take much longer to be established in China than democracy.
Thank you. A question there?
My name is Jorn Baltzersen, and I'm the editor of a forthcoming book where we question whether the Constitution actually gives us liberty. I want to follow up on democracy. With the ascent of Western civilization, we see that democracy comes fairly late, and in particular, we define democracy as the universal suffrage democracy. It dates back to around World War I. And we see also, since World War I, a rise of the size of the state. Is there a connection between the rise of the democracy and the extension of the size of the state? Also, you talked about the financial policies, the monetary policies, and we see that, according to some commentators, that we're kicking the can down the road. We're not really solving problems. Is there a tendency more in democracies than other forms of government to kick down the can down the road because we're afraid, politicians are afraid to face the consequences of actually taking the medicine that we need to give the economy?
Thanks. Two excellent questions. It's an old political economy argument going back